function, no assumption, introduction. Why don't you pick a side? Like it when you're drunk and feeling sunken. I got you feeling right. Function, no assumption, introduction. Why don't you pick a side? Like it when you're drunk and feeling sunken. I got you feeling right. I got you feeling right.
Hello and welcome to Devlog number 25. We're only a couple days from release for our first major update, which is the Modular Missiles update, and we are all really excited to get it out the door. The update's been mostly feature complete for a while, but the last month and a half or so has just been us neck deep in balancing with the testers that we've gathered from the community, and they have just been playing non-stop for that month and a half. Every time I look in the voice channels that we have for our testers, they're constantly in there playing games, and they've done an awesome job just tirelessly giving us feedback, helping us make balance changes, and I think the update is in a really good state because of all that. And I say that making it sound like it was really easy, but it was not, and we're going to talk about why it was not in depth in this devlog. And the way that we'll do that is going through all the mechanics for the missile update that I didn't cover in the last devlog, and talking about how the balance testing that we've done over the last month and a half tied into all those mechanics and the decisions that we had to make with the help of the testers. And then for those of you who stick around to the very end, we've got a special treat, which is a preview of our work on the second faction, which is the Outlying Systems Protectorate, so stick around for that. Because this devlog is going to focus so much on balance, I'm going to preface this discussion by saying that it's simply the nature of making balanced decisions for a game like this, where people play very competitively, that any kind of changes to the status quo, which the missile update is absolutely going to bring, is going to throw people for a loop. I think that the vast majority of players are really going to enjoy this update. The debriefing exit survey that we did with the testers showed us that almost all of them thought that the missile branch was more fun than the main branch, both related to missiles and general gameplay. But there are, of course, going to be people who don't like it, and there are testers who don't like it, and they've been very open with us about that. But as we discuss the balance changes throughout the course of this devlog, if you hear something that you don't like, I just ask that you go into the patch with an open mind, try it out, and see how it actually plays and whether you really do like it or don't like it. And with that out of the way, let's get started. So going all the way back to the missile concept document that I released before the game even went into early access, the primary goal of the missile update was to cut down on missile spam. And this is a really hard thing to do. The realities of missile warfare, both in the real world and in video games, is that if you have a more capable missile, it doesn't mean that you're going to fire less of them because they're more effective and you need less of them. You're going to fire the same amount and you're going to be more guaranteed to get a hit. If I need to fire 20 missiles to be guaranteed that one of those is going to get through point defenses and impact the ship, I'm not going to fire 20 missiles. I'm going to fire 30 missiles because the return on that investment is greater than firing 2 salvos of 20, because now I can get 11 missiles through instead of just 1. But reducing the missile spam is an important thing and an important goal for this update for a couple of reasons. The first is that seeing a stream of 100 missiles coming at you just looks dumb. There's no consistency to whether a salvo like that is going to get through. It's boring for the missile player, it's boring for the defending player, and this is a game and it needs to be fun. And furthermore, missiles are one of the most performance-intensive things in Nebulous, especially when there's lots of them flying around. So reducing spam means that we have better performance, less lag, less time dilation, less people getting dropped from the game. I'm happy to report that spam is mostly dead. But I will caveat that by saying that when you get onto the missile branch for the first time, I can guarantee you that everyone's going to be so excited to play with the new toys that missile fleets are probably all you're going to see for the first day or two, because that's what happened with the testers. So how did we kill spam? Well, it breaks down into 2 categories. One is hard controls restricting spam amounts, and another is incentives to make it unnecessary to do it in the first place. So let's talk about the hard controls first, in the form of the new mechanic being introduced in the update, missile programming channels. Right now on the main branch, the volume of missiles you can fire is almost completely driven by the number of VLS modules that you have on your ship. Each VLS has a 2-second time between cells, so having multiple VLS modules means that you can fire more missiles in that 2-second window. This is the reason why VLSs have compounding costs, because the more you have, the more missiles you're capable of firing faster, the denser stream rates that you get, and the more likely you are to penetrate point defenses. The first benefit of missile programming channels is that we've now decoupled missile carrying capacity from launch volume, which means that VLS compounding cost is gone. The way this mechanic works is that each ship now has a programming bus built into it, and the number of channels that that bus has varies with the hull type. You can also add to those channels with support modules. The number of channels that you have defines the number of missiles that you can program at the same time, and thus your salvo size. VLS ejection time has basically been eliminated, which means that if you have 5 channels, you can program 5 missiles simultaneously, and then all 5 of those are going to get ejected from the ship at roughly the same time, giving you a nice tight pack of 5 missiles. The real key here is that the missile programming bus is a batch system. What that means is that when 5 missiles are being prepped for launch, no other missiles can begin their preparations until those 5 have left the ship. So if you queue up 10 missiles, the first 5 are going to get channels assigned to them and begin programming. Let's say that time is 6 seconds. When those 6 seconds elapse, those 5 missiles are going to eject from the ship and launch towards their target, and then the next 5 are going to go into the batch. Once 6 more seconds elapse, those next set of 5 missiles are ejected and launched towards the targets. What this does is it creates packs of individual missiles spaced out by the programming time of that type of missile. These packs are a lot easier for point defenses to deal with than a continuous stream of 100 missiles. So penetrating PD becomes less about how many can you fire in a big stream and more about the capabilities of your individual missiles. I also changed the way the track selection widget works to get rid of something that I think almost all players found confusing at the beginning. Now that each ship has a natural salvo size, when you do the group add for the track select widget, it will now add 1 full salvo of missiles each time, and when you click on the track for the last time, it won't add another shot because now you have even salvo numbers. I can't even count the number of times that I watched people's streams as they went through the beginning weapons tutorial, and they were just so confused why, oh, I clicked twice, why are there 3 missiles launching from my ship? I thought that it was intuitive when I designed it, because each click is adding a missile, but I don't think anyone else thought that, so now it should be better. So that's the hard control. There are now strict limits on the number of missiles that can leave a ship at a given time, and a defined spacing between salvos, dependent on the type of missile. The other half of eliminating spam is incentives to make it not necessary in the first place. If there's a better way, aren't you going to use it? If you have the option between firing 5 cheap missiles that are going to get stopped by PD or 5 expensive missiles that are probably going to get through PD, obviously you're going to choose the more expensive missiles, right? Well, that's not actually the way it turned out initially when we first started testing, and it took a while to kind of figure out what we needed to do in order to get that to be the case. And by took a while, I mean almost the entire testing period. It was only about a week ago that I made the change that made it so that the missile update actually played and felt the way that I had envisioned it in my head. After over a month of testing, I was talking to the testers and I was just exasperated. Why is spam still a thing? Why are you guys not using all these expensive fancy missiles? I don't get it. And what they explained to me in their reasoning was that when it came to these expensive missiles, what you were really paying for was damage potential, and what you really should be paying for is point defense penetration. If you want to do thousands of damage in a single hit, well, we already have the mace for that, so why would I pay for an 80-point hybrid when I can use a 10-point mace? If your 80-point hybrid has the same effective chance of getting through a PD net as a swarm of gales, which is to say, not much, then it just feels like you're feeding points into a wood chipper. Or, more numerically, why would I carry 1 salvo of 5 expensive missiles when I could carry 10 salvos of 5 cheap missiles and have multiple tries to get a salvo through? With the way the hybrid missiles were balanced at the time, you weren't really getting additional PK for your extra points. So you really had no incentive to use them, and I think that this stems from my own fear of making the hybrids too powerful initially. I was worried that if I made the hybrids too powerful, then everyone was going to hate the missile update because it would just be dying to missile swarms but in a different way. So at this point I was just exasperated. We were 2 weeks from release, they didn't know that, but I did. And so I just said, alright, let's go all in. I upped all the hybrid speeds to 1,000 meters per second, gave them additional support slots, implemented a bunch of support modules like decoy launchers, penetration aids like self-screening jammers, and I put it up there and I said, alright guys, have fun. And then I went to bed. And when I woke up the next morning, I asked in the tester channels, so what did you guys think of the patch last night? Expecting it to be really negative. And surprisingly, the response was, wow, this is really awesome. Not everyone thought that, of course. Now that things were really, really scary when it came to hybrids, there was obviously a learning curve. People had to figure out how to counter them. But the fact that the hybrids were really terrifying, and when you saw one coming at you, it was not just, oh, great, another missile. Now I have to just let my point defenses take care of it. That there were considerations for putting screening ships out, having good scouting, having good AMMs that would take them out at the proper distance before they staged. They were behaving the way that they always should have been, and it really pulled the whole missile package together. Now there was distinctions between normal missiles and hybrid missiles. They had a use case. They were really good at getting through PD. And honestly, If a player is throwing an 80 to 100 point missile at a ship, unless that target player is really on their game and they have their screening ship set up properly and they have good scouting and they get the missile before it stages, it should be a hit. And now we have that. And I think the missile update is in a much better place because of it. I think people are really happy with it. The surveys certainly say that. The chat certainly says that. And frankly, I'm just really glad I made that change. I don't think the whole update would have come together if I hadn't. Other than simply upping the speed of the missiles, the addition of the support modules and extra slots to the missiles that were not there originally really helped them come into their own. If you want to go all in on an expensive missile, only having 2 slots that you can either have a seeker and a validator, or a seeker and a fallback, or a seeker and a support module puts a lot of artificial limitation on you. So I added 1 additional support slot to each of the hybrid missiles, which now adds a lot of opportunity for more diversity in builds. I really dragged my feet on getting the support modules implemented. I only finished them up about 2 weeks ago, but I'm really glad that I did because they add a lot of interesting character to the missiles, and you can configure them in a lot of different ways. There are 8 of them right now, although 2 of them are more advanced versions of 2 others, but they give a lot of capability. They range from things like hard skin, which gives you increased hit points to the missile, to self-screening jammers, decoy launchers, radar absorbent coating to make it harder for your missiles to be detected. I think the decoy launcher is probably my favorite of the support modules, and that's one of the ones that has 2 variants. There's one that launches 3 decoys, and there's one that launches 6 decoys. They're actually really effective. They spit out these decoys when they're in their terminal phase, and all of these decoys appear to be size 3 missiles to the point defense controller, and so it will try to prioritize taking out those decoys before it actually takes out the real missiles. Basically, the line of thinking is that you can turn 1 missile into 4 targets. So as long as the cost of the missile you're firing plus those 3 decoys is less than the cost of 4 missiles, you're getting the same increased penetration capability, but you only have to carry 1 missile in order to do it. And that just goes back to the theme that we have to keep driving of paying for penetration and not paying for damage. And speaking of penetration, let's talk about point defenses because there's been a lot of changes to them in this update. The most obvious of these is going to be the addition of 2 new point defense modules, the Sarissa coil gun and the Stonewall flak gun. Both of these fit on a Class 2 mount. The role of the Sarissa is to provide a long-range 6-kilometer point defense system that can take out sprinting missiles before they stage. It fires a sandshot round, and the reason that I did that was to make it so that I wouldn't have to answer the question of why did we just add railguns that fit on frigates? And the easy answer is because sandshot doesn't do anything against ships. It's just a bunch of little tungsten beads, and it's meant for shredding missiles and nothing else. The Stonewall, on the other hand, looks really cool, but I think it might be a letdown for some people. The unfortunate reality that I learned while developing the Stonewall is that the BSG-style flak barrier doesn't really work in reality. In the show, it really only served as kind of a deterrent to keep Cylon fighters away. It was never really very good at shooting down anything. I spent a really long time revamping the targeting logic for the Stonewall, iterating on it, trying to get it to be really good, and in the end, what it really boiled down to was that some of the time it would take out every missile in a raid of 100, and other times it would take out 0 of them, and there was no in between, and it was very sensitive on any movement in the center of the raid. It would be unable to achieve an actual good firing solution. And so I was able to eventually fix the Stonewall by just flipping its flag from barrier defense to standard point defense, and it instantly just became a really big, really effective rebound, and it's now really good at just taking out swarms of cheap missiles all clustered together. Which, again, is another great incentive for not just using cheap spam missiles. And the final counter to spam is the change in chaff's duration, taking it from 15 to 45 seconds. Spam missiles are almost always built on a shoestring budget. They don't have validating seekers, they have simple radar seekers, which makes chaff extremely effective against them. And by having a chaff round that can now linger for 45 seconds, it makes it really effective against those kind of builds. On the other hand, there was a pretty major rebalance for the Aurora. The issue with the Aurora right now is that if you have spare points and spare power, you're always going to take an Aurora because it's the most effective form of point defense. And so what that leads to is just battleships covered in Auroras and completely immune to missiles. But with all of this point defense diversity that we have now, I want to encourage players to use varying types, and so the Aurora has been placed in a very specific niche. And that niche is now countering sprinting missiles. Now that we have hybrid missiles that do their terminal sprints at up to 1,000 meters per second, the only thing that can really stop them is a laser. But in order to make it so the lasers can stop them while still not overpowering every other type of missile, they've been given a very short active time of about 2 seconds, which is just long enough for them to acquire a sprinter and take it out, and then start their cooldown in time to pick up the next one, while still being able to be overwhelmed by smaller missiles. This makes it so that the optimal solution is not always taking Auroras and having a layered point defense strategy instead. The Defender also got a huge buff to its performance, a couple improvements such as improvements to its tracking logic to account for acceleration, improvements to the way turrets are aimed, as well as the ability to lock as quickly as possible rather than waiting for a full sensor cycle. And finally, you can now customize the logic for your interceptor missiles. You still have the same point defense missile settings that you had in-game before, but now you can give specific doctrine to specific missile types that you designed. So let's say that you want to make a size 2 interceptor that's designed to go after only size 3 missiles, and it's going to target the farthest ones first. Well, you can do that now. You can even set the individual preferred salvo sizes per missile type. This adds a ton of new options for counter-missile gameplay and allows you to tailor your interceptor missiles for exactly the purposes that you need. I've even seen some of the testers experimenting with size 2 hybrid interceptors, which is just really cool that they're going down that path. So basically what this boils down to is that layered PD is now the name of the game, and that makes missile defense less of a passive activity. You no longer have to just sit there and cross your fingers and hope that your PD is working. There's a lot more options based on how you configure this layered PD setup, how you configure your interceptor missiles, what you designed them to do, what the inner layers of that defense is, where you're going to place your picket ships in order to protect your capital ships. And of course, in the end, there's still that crossing the fingers aspect, hoping that the thing that you set up, the way you configured it, where you positioned your ships is going to work out for you, and that your point defenses are going to do what they need to do, but it still gives a lot more active capability to the Defender rather than just sitting there and waiting and taking it. And finally, there's one more note that I'd like to make on missile capabilities that I thought was pretty interesting. There's a certain player who's well known in the community for what's called the Yub-Nub technique. What that is loading up a fleet with nothing but thunderheads, sitting behind an asteroid and waypoint missile striking around and taking out the enemy, and apparently he's really good at it. And honestly, I'm happy about this. I think that the ability to do waypoint missile strikes like that is one of the most unique aspects of missile gameplay in Nebulous. Obviously, I want to cut down on the number of missiles that are used to do it, but I think the tactic is great and I do it myself a lot. And so because I love this mechanic so much, I'd initially made it so that both types of guidance modules, the cruise module which is waypoint capable and the direct module which is not, both had a cost of 0. I did that because I was worried that if cruise had a cost, basically no players except the most advanced would take it, and I would be punishing those advanced players for using those advanced tactics. But the ability to position your ships in a place where they're safe and still be able to fire devastating missile strikes on the enemy has immense tactical value and does have a point cost that it's worth, and so now the cruise module does have a cost, so that you can't just fire the cheapest of the cheap missiles around corners and be invulnerable while you do it. Alright, we're wrapping up here. Let's get on to the last couple things, which are actually changes to existing mechanics in the game rather than new stuff for this update. The first of these is a change to the way that electronic warfare and jamming works. Right now, I know that it's become popular to carry 6 or more jammers on a single fleet and make it so that you're basically invisible to the enemy until you're within visual range. So in order to counter that, what I've done is I've added diminishing returns to stacking jamming power. It uses the same formula but with a different coefficient than the module stacking penalties do, so basically by the time you get to the 4th jammer on the same target, you're only at about 30% of the power for that 4th jammer as you are for the first one, which is operating at 100%. This should keep jamming useful but make it less overbearing in that the solution is not always now stack the maximum number of jammers that you can because you're only going to get so much utility out of it. And finally, the amount of time that we spent debating railgun versus cannon changes in the missile test balance channel is a little absurd. As I mentioned in the previous devlog, there were changes to the way that overpenetration mechanics work based on an internal hull density that provided a lot of changes to the way that projectile weapons work. Now, penetration is no longer driven by a contrived range fall-off curve that I had implemented in order to drive people to using weapons at the ranges I preferred them to be used at. What this meant is that railguns would basically always overpenetrate anything smaller than a light cruiser and always stop inside of a battleship. The biggest issue with balancing railguns is that they do a huge discrepancy of damage between when they overpenetrate and when they don't. A normal penetration for a railgun does 175 damage, which is enough damage to destroy basically any component in the game with damage reduction. On the other hand, when they overpen, they do about 28 damage, and that's divided between all of the components that they pass through. So basically, maybe 5 damage per component. This made them either completely useless or totally overbearing depending on the target that they were shooting at. So what I've done for railguns in this update is significantly narrowed that damage envelope. Now they do a relatively consistent amount of damage over their long range, able to suppress targets and give them something to think about without instantly graying components as soon as they hit something. I've also increased their probability of creating a debuff, which means that they'll keep your DC teams very busy, starting fires, making atmosphere leaks, and other debuffs that are triggered by that. On the other hand, cannons, particularly 450mm, have gotten a huge buff in this update. Both a damage increase and the new penetration mechanics mean that they hit like a truck. What this basically boils down to is that cannons and rails now have their own separate niches without overlapping with each other. Cannons do a ton of damage up close, and rails deliver consistent damage and high debuff probability over a very long range as a support and suppression weapon. And now, to close out this devlog, let's give a little preview of the concurrent work that we've been doing on Faction 2, the Outlying Systems Protectorate. It took us a little longer than I would have liked to get started on the OSP for a couple reasons. The first is that it was really hard to find a concept artist who could give us what we were looking for when it came to their design, and we'll discuss why that was so hard in a little bit. And just the other part was my task saturation with doing development for the missile update made it very hard to coordinate with artists and figure out how to get the concept art made. But we ended up finding a great artist named Papa Panda. I just happened to be scrolling Twitter and saw some examples of his homeworld art, and I was like, this guy's perfect. I sent him a DM, told him what we were looking for, and he produced some really great concept images that I'm going to flash up here as we go through the ships. His link is going to be in the video description if you want to check him out and give him a follow. The first thing that I want to say is that our goal for the OSP is to make sure that they don't play like the Alliance at all, and there's a couple things that we're going to do in order to make sure that that happens. Let's talk about their backstory first. So basically, the OSP is a collection of 3 star systems as part of the Alliance. They're one of the oldest and most influential member nations, but because of their positioning in the galactic geography, they're kind of left as an afterthought because they're off in the backwaters. They have no border that abuts any other galactic nation. They're just off in the back and kind of get left out because of it. And they're obviously very bitter about this. They don't have the same kind of pull they used to have in Alliance politics. They're treated like a backwater despite being one of the oldest and most respected groups in the Alliance, and they hate that. I'm really oversimplifying this here, but if you're interested in the backstory of the OSP and the Alliance in general, you can go read our lore document, which is linked in the Discord. Suffice it to say that after the inciting incident, the Alliance blockades the Bethel system. The OSP then has to rapidly build up combat power for a navy that they don't have because they rely on the Alliance Navy's protection, so now they need to figure out what to do. And what their pre-staged plan was to seize every commercial vessel in the system and rapidly begin converting it into fighting vessels. The OSP faction isn't going to follow the same traditional naval structure that the Alliance follows, so there's not going to be your corvette, frigate, destroyer, battleship, etc. OSP ships are grouped into 3 categories, and the first one we'll talk about is the most familiar in that it's just an old mothballed Alliance cruiser class, and we'll go over this one first because it's the most similar to what people are used to before we get to the weird stuff. So this is the Ocello class. Basically, it's meant to look like a predecessor to the Axford. We showed the concept artist the examples of the current ships that we had and say, take this and turn it back 100 years. And the lore is basically that as the Axford was brought into service, these ships started to get decommissioned and get sent off to mothball or to backwater patrol routes, which tends to be the OSP space, which is why they have a bunch of them just lying around. And we just tried to put a lot of anachronistic things on the hull. We decided what an old version of the Alliance paint scheme would look like, obviously Dazzle Camo because it's just cool. The big mast at the back, the old-looking radar panels that look close enough to the modern Alliance panels, but they're bulkier and boxier, so they just look old. And basically the OSP uses this as their command and control ship. It's the only ship that can really go toe-to-toe with another armored warship one-on-one. The rest of the OSP's naval organization is split into 2 groups that we're calling line ships and clippers. I don't have any clipper models ready to go to show you, so we're just going to flash the concept art up here and show off a couple of the designs, but basically their role is to be small, fast scouts and attack ships. They're probably going to focus pretty heavily on spinal weapons. The reason for that is that turrets are really complicated. They have a lot of parts to maintain, they're difficult to engineer, they're difficult to install, they require a lot of supporting infrastructure both to make them work and to make them not shear off the mount when they turn. And so it's a lot easier for the OSP to just cut out the front of the ship and install a spinal mount on there than try to get a turret to work. On the other hand, line ships are the exact opposite end of the spectrum. These are the OSP's mainstay brawling ships. They are converted freighters, tankers, container ships, etc. that they've taken into shipyards, reinforced as much as they can, and installed a bunch of weapons on. The most difficult thing when it came to designing the OSP was making it so that it was plausible and believable. The thing about freighters is that, yeah, they all follow a basic layout, but they are all also unique. What we didn't want was for it to be a situation where it's a wink, nod, nod, yep, this is a freighter that's been converted to a warship, but really they're all the same because every cargo ship in the entire Alliance space is just the same model replicated over and over again. The reason it took us so long to find a concept artist and get concepts that we liked was that it's really hard to make a modular ship that doesn't just look like Legos, and I'm really glad that we found Papa Panda because the work that he did is incredible. I'll show you some of the concept art here. He managed to make spaceships that also look like surface vessel cargo ships, but also have a unique modular structure that can be mixed and matched to create a bunch of different variety. So here's an example of the blockout for the bulker ships that we have, and this is a variety of 3 different bows, 3 different midsections, and 3 different engine sections that are all part of a modular hull system. And when I said I wanted the OSP to play really uniquely from the Alliance and not have a lot of similarities, I really mean it. When you create a new line ship in the fleet editor, my goal is to make it so that you get a random ship layout and it's never going to be the same and you don't get to pick what that layout is. I think that a player who's going to play the OSP should accept the fact that when they decide to play this faction, they're going to be playing by the OSP's rules. And that means getting accustomed to the fact that they're fighting with what they've got. And yes, conceivably you could ship scum and keep adding the hull until you get a layout that you like, but roughly all of these are going to have the same internal and external socket layouts. They'll just look different. Overall, I think this is going to be a really cool addition to the game. It's going to be a really interesting second faction. It's going to do things that I think people are not really used to in a lot of strategy games. I can't really think of one off the top of my head that's doing something similar, and just create a unique style of play for players who don't want to play the Alliance anymore. The Outlying Systems Protectorate is going to be the next major update for the game. I'm saying that to distinguish it from minor updates along the way of small little patches and bug fixes and content updates and new features, but this is going to be a big addition of content in the form of a whole second faction and the weapons that are associated with it. Other things that are on the horizon, we've promised that we'll be releasing the Conquest concept document shortly. Right now it's just about a 14-page document that I wrote in my free time. It hasn't really been gone through by Marshall and Stefmo and Lauren, so all of us are going to have to sit down and go through that and make sure that it's not just my ideas and that anything that they see in there that could be problematic, we can get fixed in terms of game mechanics and stuff. And once it's in a good place, we'll get it released so that everyone can read it and see what the update after the OSP is going to come with. We're really excited to get that concept document out, so it will be as soon as possible. I think that that update is going to be the biggest change to the game, and it will really add what Nebulous is missing in terms of making it a full, complete package. So that covers it for this really long devlog. There was a lot to talk about, but it's been a long process getting this missile update ready to go. I'm really excited to get it out the door. I can't wait to move on to Conquest and finishing up the OSP, and I hope that you guys are as excited for that as I am. I think that our release on Saturday is going to go really well. The testers are having a lot of fun with the patch, and I know that you all are going to have a lot of fun with it too. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the battle space.